coming to us from State College, Pennsylvania. It's been nice to communicate with them over the last couple of years to set this up. To have them come to speak at our roundtable. One of the things I always enjoy about meeting different people in the roundtables is the roundtable movement that we're all part of. Some of us are in other roundtables also, and bring people from different roundtables to discuss, present, and meet is always a great thrill. And Lynn and Julianne, like I said, they're avid reenactors. They've been in the Civil War time period. Julianne's been a registered nurse for 45 years in the operating room. That's her background. So it's been really nice to get to know them and have them come speak to us tonight. So to bring up the presentation and get it going, I'd like to first bring up Lynn to kick off the presentation first. He wants to start it up here.
All right, thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much for having us in the Chicago Civil Roundtable. Julianne and I are actually officers of our Central Pennsylvania Civil Roundtable based out of St. College, PA. And I was president and she's secretary, and we were discussing how many years it's been. It's been over 15 years because nobody else wants to take it. I've been trying to get out of it for years, and so is she. We're still one of the youngest people in the group, so. He said, you keep going. Okay, first thing we're gonna do is everyone's gonna look at their cell phones and turn them off or on vibrate. So we don't get that very embarrassing phone call during the presentation. This past, I'll give you a quiz. I'll show you the quiz. That's all I need, quiz. All right, where was the Army of the Potomac 160 years ago today on May 10th, 1864? Spotsylvania. Interesting that because we had a wonderful speaker. I hope you have him, Chris Bukowski from Fredericksburg, who spoke to our roundtable on Tuesday about the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Wilderness on May 4, 5, and 6. But the day after, May 8th, turning point in the Civil War, he maintains, and as you all know, Gettysburg is the turning point in the war, right? He maintains the Battle of Wilderness because on May 8th, General Grant turned south, and there would be no turning back. Anyway, because I'm also president, I'm also a program coordinator, whatever, and we work as a team to get good programs and speakers. And like you, we want to get those great battlefield guys, the great lecturers, the field trip people, and all that kind of thing. We're not. We're tourists. We travel, and we travel in the United States. And then we find these little fun little sites across America and make programs out of that. I went to the fall in Penn State to the Rose Bowl in Pasadena some 10 years ago to develop a program on the Civil War in California and Arizona. I'm going to be in 2027. It's got asked 3 weeks ago to go to Scottsdale, Arizona for the New Mexico campaign, the Battle of Gloria Pass. And then as well as that one for the Battle of Biloxi in Florida. And also the conspirators who are confined to Fort Jefferson. But you have chosen my wife's program tonight. So, speaking of dates, September 17th, 1862, the Great Battle of Antietam. You all know it. 23,000 Americans lost their lives, dead, missing, or wounded that day. The same day. The irony is, ladies and gentlemen, is that on the very same day, the largest loss of civilian life also occurred, which is very much obscured because of what Julianne represents you tonight. So this time I turn the program to Julianne. She's going to read the tale. I'm going to do the PowerPoint. Thank you and hope you enjoy our program.
Okay, is this mic on? Can you hear me? No. Okay. Off. You could get it to work. Should I just use my big girl voice or?
No, I think it's working.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting us to your roundtable, and thank you for your warm welcome. I spoke to a few members here and for Brian and everyone who's done so much to help us feel welcome. People will look at me and they think, what made you interested in the Allegheny Arsenal? Well, I guess I could say that probably the long answer was I've been reenacting for years, and I kind of got interested in what the roles of women, and then I learned about the Allegheny Arsenal, and I wanted to learn more about it. And I did a program for our local library, and I just started developing the program, and it got longer. But women did so much during the Civil War that we often don't think about. They were spies, which I've done reenacting, served in the Confederate Navy. I've also been served as a nurse, but women worked on farms. They were abolitionists, they were artists, they were journalists. They did lots of things during the war. But what I want to talk about tonight is that the success of women, the success of the war effort depended on women supporting their families while their menfolk went to war. Many embraced jobs that supported the war effort, like stitching uniforms or working in arsenals filling cartridges. So I'd read about disastrous, still not on? Sorry.
There you go. Hold it.
Okay, is that better? If you can't hear me, raise your hands because I can have a big mouth too. Okay, I will. Okay, numerous disastrous arsenal incidents. November 5th, 1862, 47 workers were killed in Jackson, Mississippi, when the Jackson Arsenal suffered an explosion. 17 were women and girls. On March 13th, 1863, 40 female workers were killed in an explosion on Browns Island at the Richmond, Virginia Arsenal. And then on June 17th, 1864, there were 21 female victims of an arsenal explosion in Washington City. President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edward Stanton both attended the funeral for these victims. But by far, the worst civilian disaster of the Civil War occurred on September 17, 1862. While the Battle of Antietam raged, as Lynn mentioned, another event now almost forgotten occurred near Pittsburgh. That day, 156 women and girls were supporting the war effort by working at the Allegheny Arsenal near Pittsburgh. That afternoon, 78 civilians, mainly young women and girls, were killed in an explosion at the arsenal, the largest loss of civilian life in the Civil War and the worst disaster of the United States arsenal during the war. Okay, at the outbreak of the Civil War, Pittsburgh was well on its way to becoming the continent's premier manufacturing center. The story of the disaster begins in 1814, 3 miles upriver from Pittsburgh in the small but growing town of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, now one of the largest neighborhood area near Pittsburgh, in what would be annexed to the city of Pittsburgh in 1868. It was founded by William Barclay Foster, father of the famous composer Stephen Foster, who was born there on July 4th, 1826, and is Lawrenceville's most famous native son. So I have a question right now. How many watched the Kentucky Derby Saturday? Good many? Okay, so what song did they sing before the Derby started? Very good. And who wrote that? Very good. Yeah, he was in Bardstown, Kentucky, they say, when he wrote that. So that's kind of the connection with the Allegheny Arsenal and the Fosters. So interesting. The town was named for Captain James Lawrence, hero of the World War of 1812, who's famous for the dying words, "Don't give up the ship." The area spent its early years as a quiet farming community. Eventually, new mills and foundries provided jobs for unskilled German and Irish immigrants who were fleeing the potato famine, and the Germans were seeking religious freedom. Because of its accessibility as river transportation and its proximity to what was then the nation's only iron-producing district, the United States government purchased 30 acres between what is now 39th and 40th Streets from William Foster for $12,000 to erect an arsenal, which soon grew to 38 acres. It was named the Allegheny Arsenal, and it dominated the town of Lawrenceville, running roughly parallel to the Allegheny River the entire length of the town. Butler Street was the main thoroughfare, bisecting the Arsenal into two halves. It was designed by P.H. Latrobe. The Arsenal was surrounded by stone walls 8 feet tall and guarded by uniformed soldiers at the various gates. Situated just 2.5 miles east of Pittsburgh, it was established by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department to manufacture gun cartridges, horse and infantry equipment, and ammunition for the United States military. It also served as storage, inspection, and repair facility for the cannon and small arms made at the nearby Fort Pitt Foundry, just 2 miles downriver. Its entrance featured bronze British cannon, which were captured at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, and pyramids of stacked cannonballs. The Allegheny Arsenal produced the cannonballs for Matthew Perry's fleet, which was battling on Lake Erie in the War of 1812. By the Civil War, it was one of America's principal ordnance innovators and manufacturers of ammunition for small arms and artillery. It contributed to technological advancement, most notably experiments in casting techniques for the large cannon by Major Thomas Rodman. Nearly 70% of all Union artillery tubes were cast in the Pittsburgh foundries. Nearby natural resources were the components of black powder. Leather goods were also produced in large numbers, from bridles to holsters to backpacks, and all came from the Allegheny Arsenal. The small town became a factory town, growing in population from 4,589 in 1820 to 12,940 in 1860. Rows of 2- and 3-story houses, which were in walking distance of the sprawling complex of shops and laboratories, which from 1861 to 1865 turned out millions of rounds of musket ammunition and a wide range of shot for the Union artillery. No wonder it is referred to as the Arsenal of the Union by historians today. The 156 women employed at the Arsenal were young girls, daughters, sweethearts, wives, widows, and mothers living in and around the Lawrenceville section of Pittsburgh. In September of 1862, many were struggling to support their families while their husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers were fighting in the Union Army. Early in the war, the Army was reluctant to hire women as nurses, but officers in charge of arsenals employed women as early as June of 1861. The decision to hire women at arsenals was based on a matter-of-fact assessment of labor needs and the gender notion of obedience that inspired the Army's decision to open munitions work to women. Community members such as physicians and clergymen provided character references before they could begin work, as it was not considered proper for women to work outside the home. Work at the Allegheny Arsenal was permitted as it supported the war effort. But these young civilians weren't soldiers expecting battle or possible death. Arsenal jobs offered competitive salaries, like $14 to $25 a month, making this job more desirable than textile manufacturing and a chance for women who desired to engage in war-making activities. Many of the women working in the Allegheny Arsenal were impoverished Irish Catholic immigrants with a dire need to earn extra money in the inflated war economy and thus survive the war years. Employment in a wartime munitions factory fit the traditions of working class respectability. Women could move in and out of the workforce as needed and still keep order in the home and maintain appearance in the neighborhood. Employment at the Arsenal was often a family affair. Men who held positions arranged for their daughters to work there, especially as they went off to work or needed additional income. It was not uncommon for several younger members from the same family to be employed at the Arsenal. This made the catastrophe even more tragic. The commander of the Arsenal was Colonel John Symington of Maryland and an uncle of General George Pickett. Graduating sixth in his class, West Point in 1815, Symington was a career military man, devoting 50 years of his life to the armed forces. He had been stationed at the Arsenal since 1857. Many people disliked Symington for a variety of reasons. As pre-war tension rose, a controversy occurred in December of 1860 when Symington received orders to ship 100 cannons to forts being built in Biloxi, Mississippi, and Galveston, Texas. Citizens and civic leaders balked, and the order was rescinded. Then his son joined the Confederate Army, and his daughter shocked the people of the Lawrenceville church by wearing a Confederate rosette. When Colonel Symington was appointed commander of the Arsenal, a macadamized road of hard, flinty stone was built between the laboratory and the other buildings. Workers warned management of the potential for explosion if powder came in contact with the road and advocated for softer stone. Iron horseshoes and wagon wheel rims were feared to cause sparks and ignite the powder which had been spilled on the roadway from the barrels of poorly fitting lids or that which had fallen to the wooden floors of the laboratory. Alexander McBride, superintendent of the lab, had wood chips and sawdust spread over the road to decrease the risk of igniting the powder. Symington reprimanded him and ordered all the wood chips to be swept away. Symington also refused to give a half holiday on Saturday so that the accumulated powder could be swept away. Trained as a cooper, McBride also complained that DuPont insisted on recycling its wooden powder barrels, which led to loose fitting lids and spilled powder. As war escalated, the Arsenal struggled to meet ammunition quotas. Another problem for the recently promoted Colonel John Symington led him to write this account on in an October 22nd, 1861 letter to his superior, General James W. Ripley. He wrote, "Matches were discovered among the bundles of cartridges prepared to be packed in one of the rooms. The strictest investigation failed to detect the offender. Stringent measures were then resorted to, and the boys searched going to work and leaving, which still continues. The offense has, however, been since repeated in the same room. And as the perpetrators could not be discovered, all the boys in the room, over 20 in number, were on each occasion discharged and have not been reemployed. It was hoped that as some 2 weeks passed since the last occurrence, that the malicious spirit had quelled. But yesterday, a similar attempt at mischief was discovered in the same room. That the offender did not belong to that room is thus made evident, and I have discharged all the boys at work in that portion of the laboratory and will supply their places with females." So response to his call for the female applicants was brisk, and Symington quickly filled the positions with women. Once women were employed in the powder rooms, the colonel reported no additional discipline problems. Women were obedient, followed the rules, and did the simple, repetitive work with extreme caution to avoid catastrophic explosions. The number of employees at the Allegheny Arsenal had increased from 308 in April of 1861 to 1,189 in January of 1862. They worked to load cartridges and artillery shells, fill canisters with grape shot, manufacture leather accoutrements, and build gun cartridges and caissons. 136 of these workers were civilians, of which 30 were men. Women and girls were preferred, as the girls were more dexterous, less disruptive, and more amenable to instruction. Employment as a cartridge maker provided a steady income. These young women, many as young as 12, worked 6 days a week for 12 hours a day, but they were turning out 128,000 cartridges a day. For this dangerous labor, they earned 50 cents to $1.10 a day. Each worker had to meet a daily minimum, and those unable to meet the quota were subject to dismissal. Now, just a few words on cartridges. Although brass-jacketed bullets were invented in 1808 and were refined in the 1830s, by the Civil War, the technology had not advanced to mass produce them. Most Civil War soldiers used a cartridge that had a pre-measured powder charge of gunpowder and a mini ball wrapped in paper. It was this kind of cartridge that was assembled by hand at the Allegheny Arsenal. By the end of 1861, the Arsenal had produced almost 10 million small arms cartridges, each hand-packed with black powder and wrapped in paper. To assemble the paper cartridges, these young women, with their nimble fingers, small hands, and light touch, carefully folded the paper tubes with gunpowder, added another paper tube which contained the bullet, and then closed them by making a complex series of folds at the end of the cartridge. Tedious but simple work, but it required extreme care. The slightest spark could ignite the gunpowder, the residue which was scattered all over the buildings. I want you to look at the bundle up there in the top left. That's what's called a bundle. Like I mentioned, the matches were found in the bundle. And you'll hear me talk about some of the other girls coming up. The girls say that they were bundlers, assembling bundles. So that's what that is. I didn't know what a bundle was, but when I saw that photo, it made sense to me. Anyhow. Okay, the Arsenal was a complex of several buildings. The 158 cartridge makers worked in a single-story wood frame building called the Laboratory, one of the busiest facilities at the Arsenal. The laboratory was a wooden building in the shape of the letter E, with the back and the arms of the E divided into 8 workrooms. In the space between the arms, 2 covered porches were built to accommodate deliveries. The lab was divided into 14 rooms with a series of covered porches on one side. September 17, 1862 is considered the bloodiest day of the Civil War. The Battle of Antietam was raging near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. For the workers of the Arsenal, it was just a warm work day in Pittsburgh and payday. That day, 156 women and girls who worked at packing powder cartridges arrived at work early in the morning for their 12-hour shift. As young girls do, they gossiped and relayed the grim news from the battlefield and shared other tidbits of information. Throughout the day, they were called to their respective workrooms to get their pay. Catherine Burkhart's school days were behind her, at least what little schooling she had. At age 15, she was now a full-fledged member of the wartime workforce. On the morning of September 17th, she left the log house she shared with her mother and set off to work, walking to the Arsenal. Entering her workplace from the busy Butler Street, she joined other school-age girls on the best day of the month, payday. But she had not signed up for a cause. She just wanted to help her widowed mother pay the rent and make ends meet. So on this quiet payday, the paymaster had arrived at the main lab and set up his table in a nearby building used as a changing room for the workers. The lab employees were called out in groups to receive their pay. Around 2 p.m., Teamster Joseph R. Frick was delivering 10 100-pound wooden barrels of DuPont gunpowder in a horse-drawn wagon up the stone road. These were dropped off at room number 1. Next, 5 barrels were placed on the porch near room number 12, and the last 2 barrels were placed by the L-shaped building at the entrances of rooms number 13 and 14. Upon returning to room number 1, there was a strong possibility that a spark generated from Frick's front right iron-rimmed wagon wheel or from one of his horse's hooves created a blaze from gunpowder spilled on the runway. The blaze traveled up the porch and ignited the 3 barrels he had delivered earlier. Taking a break on the porch of room number 12, Rachel Dunlap, an employee, saw a spark flash near one of the horse's hooves and the iron-bound wagon wheel. Then she saw a sheet of flame. There was a loud explosion. Frick was blown 200 yards from his wagon, but survived. One of his 2 horses were badly burned. Room number 1 attendant, Robert Smith, was killed instantly. Rachel fell to the floor, and with help from her sister, she and other employees fled from the building. At the same moment, John Ryder, who was packing cartridges in a room adjoining the porch, looked out an open door and saw a flash of powder. Running out the door, he found himself forced back by the explosions of barrels of powder. Around 2:05 p.m., a fire created by the first explosion, which is C on the diagram, worked its way around the courtyard and ignited the 5 barrels of gunpowder delivered by Frick to create a second, even more devastating explosion that destroyed the entire building, killing many in room 3, 4, and 6. The second explosion blew off the roof of the main laboratory and started a fire, destroying the laboratory, the engine house, and the lives of the workers within. At 2:06 p.m., a third explosion quickly followed at the L-shaped building, wrecking the packing and shipping buildings. This was probably caused by the second explosion igniting one or both of the just delivered barrels. These 3 thunderous explosions, just minutes apart, shattered windows at the surrounding community and were heard in Pittsburgh, 2 miles away. A witness described the blast as it sounded like the firing of cannons. 3 rapid reports. Panicked workers ran from the buildings, jumped out of second-floor windows and yelled, "Rebels are blowing us up." They thought they were under an enemy attack. As the workers tried to flee, flaming walls and roofs collapsed on top of them. By the time the Lawrenceville and Pittsburgh volunteer fire companies arrived with their firefighting equipment on horse-drawn wagons and a bucket brigade, the lab had been reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. And firefighting efforts were also hampered by cartridges and bullets, which continued to go off by themselves. Survivors of the disaster held nothing back as they recalled their experiences. I'll relate some of these experiences that they spoke of. There was a great hurry for ammunition on the account of the Battle of Antietam then being fought, and orders from Washington were to rush ammunition with all possible speed to the front, recalled worker Mary McCandless McClaw, age 13. She and her sister Elizabeth were working bundling cartridges into packs. As she related, "My sister and I walked to work from our home on Penn Avenue and 17th Street that morning as usual. It was payday. I was a bundler in room 13. The morning passed quickly. We did not stop for lunch at 12 o'clock on account of the rush. This provided a lucky circumstance. We were permitted to go to lunch at 1 o'clock, and before returning to work, were paid our wages. This deviation from the usual routine and the fact that it was payday saved many lives." At 2 o'clock, another girl and I were the only persons in room 13. The other girls were in another building getting their pay and in the yard. Suddenly, there was a terrific roar and the earth seemed to split apart. The girl with me jumped through a window and I followed her, alighting on top of her in some grass behind the building. I lifted her to her feet and we both started to run toward Butler Street. As we ran, there was a second explosion, and before we reached the street, a third one. Looking at the building we just left, we saw it being torn to pieces. My sister escaped in some manner. She has never been able to tell me just how. I was a nervous wreck for several weeks and terribly shocked that night that I had to be held in bed by force. Another worker, Mary Jane Black, remembered running from the building and hearing the sounds of screams behind her. Turning, she saw two girls. They were on fire. Their faces were burning and blood running from them. I pulled the clothes off one of them, and while doing this, the other ran up and begged me to cover her. I did not succeed in saving either one. Mothers, hearing the explosion, rushed to the arsenal to find fragments of their daughters scattered around the arsenal. There were bitter tears of anguish from those who recognized the deceased or sought in vain for those who would never return. It was not uncommon for employees of the Allegheny Arsenal to have family members working at the facility. At the time of the explosion, 14-year-old Katie McBride was hunched over a table, her back stiff and her eyes bleary as she worked filling cartridges. Her father, Alexander McBride, the superintendent of the lab, was in his office, which is room number 8, when the first explosion occurred. His account appeared in the Pittsburgh Daily Post during the coroner's inquest. I heard a noise on the porch and rose to ascertain the cause. I heard a scream. A half minute afterwards, looking in the direction of the sound, I noticed a wall falling towards me into the room. I got on the window at the end of the room and fell out, and having got out of the dust, and the flame returned along the side of the laboratory to room number 6 to seek my daughter, got on the porch and met Joseph E. Bowman with a girl on his arm coming out. At the same time, I saw the ceiling of room number 6 falling on the floor where the children were. The flames and the dust forced me back. Mr. Bowman let down the child he had upon the porch, and near the fence, I saw a girl bewildered with her clothes burnt off. We can only imagine the heartbreak Mr. McBride felt knowing his daughter had just perished. However, he performed heroically, as we can observe from his further heartbreaking sworn testimony. I returned onto the porch, entered room number 12 for a bucket, which was always there, but found no water in it. I saw Mr. Geary in room 14 and tried to get the windows and doors of rooms 13 and 14 closed. I succeeded partly and then went down to the pond with the bucket to get water, hardly knowing for what I wanted it. I got the water and returned to the fences. I met another girl in the same condition as the other and threw the bucket of water upon her. I passed around a shanty near the pond where we kept empty boxes and found Annie Snook and Annie Sibley with their clothes burned, trying to crawl through the fence. One of them said, "How can we go, and us naked?" I went and begged some women to get some clothing and take it to them at the stable, where I supposed they had gone. Back to employee Joseph Elder Bowman, a clerk, he had successfully rescued a child from the same room where Katie McBride worked. He then returned to the roaring inferno to search for his daughter, Mary Abigail, age 14. He was never seen again. George D. Clousey, the superintendent of the cylinder departments, died along with his daughter, Emma. Michael Neckerman was another Arsenal employee whose daughter perished in the explosion. Neckerman was the constant assistant of Lieutenant Rodman in all his gun experiments. That is the gigantic Rodman gun, which you saw previously on the slides. He worked with Rodman at the Watertown Arsenal in Boston in 1859, returning to the Allegheny Arsenal in 1860 so he could be with his family. Here is a photo of Neckerman's oldest daughter, Frederita, and the only known image of any of the 72 girls or women killed that day. Fredalina was also known as Melinda or Lena and was born in 1843, making her 19 in 1862. She was one of the unfortunate girls working assembling bullet cartridges in room number 1 of the laboratory, where a spark ignited those barrels of gunpowder on the porch in front. The explosions collapsed the roof, killing 22 of the 28 girls working in that same room. Neckerman wrote in his diary about this family tragedy. Our eldest daughter, Fredalina, who was engaged to a brave young man, saddler by trade, lost her life in the terrible explosion in the Arsenal on September 17, 1862. One hand was found on which was an engagement ring by which it was identified and was buried in the Allegheny Cemetery with 74 other unfortunate young ladies. Her intended, William Corning, through grief, enlisted in the Army and lost his life in a battle in Virginia. That was the hardest blow that ever befell us, although there is some consolation in knowing that they both died for their country. Incidentally, his diary was written in German and then translated by his grandson. Contemporary newspapers spared no details as observers and relatives described the horrors to reporters. There was not a particle of clothing left on the majority of the victims. The very stockings were torn from their feet, rings from their fingers, and in some instances, nothing but a headless trunk remained. Nevertheless, many were buried by their hair, by a scrap of their dress they wore, and by the greatest number. But the greatest number could never be fully recognized. 45 of the dead were so badly burned and mutilated they could not be identified. It was a gruesome and hopeless task to identify the bodies. Onlookers discovered remains riddled by shells and cartridges and mini balls. Bodies, as well as stray limbs, bones, and scraps of clothing, were found hundreds of feet from the explosion on the streets and in the Allegheny River and suspended in trees. Body parts were found up to 200 feet away. Some accounts will tell you a half a mile away and floating in the Allegheny River. One hand was identified by the ring which remained on a finger, one by a necklace which remained around a headless neck. Let's face it, a body does not survive 125,000 rounds of exploding ammunition. Philip McKinney was burned beyond recognition and identified only by his false teeth. Where the heat was most intense, there was nothing but white bones in a heap. They just burned like pine logs. Another quote, of the main buildings, nothing remained but a heap of smoking debris. The ground about was strewn with fragments of charred wood, torn clothing, balls, caps, grape shot, exploded shells, fragments of dinner baskets, steel springs from hoop skirts, cartridge paper, sheet iron, and melted lead. About 150 workers were injured in the explosion, many with agonizing burns. Others in distant buildings were injured in the ensuing panic, trying to escape through crowded wooden stairways. One broke her neck jumping from a window. Women wearing hoop skirts had a difficult time escaping through the windows. Even though most of the citizens of Lawrenceville rushed to the aid of their neighbors in need, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette recorded several acts of horrible desecration of the dead in its September 18th edition. In the side of one girl, 7 mini balls were discovered. These balls were all picked out and carried off by curiosity seekers. A brass tube, supposed to be a cannon primer, was picked from the heart of one of the victims. So let's get to a little bit of the cause here now. A coroner's inquest began immediately, conducted by the coroner, John McClone, who impaneled a jury that very evening of the explosion. The coroner's jury assembled in the Lawrenceville Borough Council chamber, where they took testimony. Rachel Dunlap confirmed wagon driver Robert Frick's testimony that a flame shot up from between the wagon wheel and his horse's rear hoof. Her position was such that she was the only person who could have witnessed this ignition, Mr. Smith having perished. Other testimony concerned the spilled powder and the stone road. Others pointed to the lax enforcement of safety rules by Alexander McBride. At the conclusion of the inquest, the split jury resolved that the accident was the result of the negligent conduct of Colonel Symington and his subordinates for allowing loose powder to accumulate. The explosion was the result of mismanagement, specifically creating an environment with an increased risk of explosion and failing to implement safety precautions. The most commonly held view was that the metal shoe of a horse had struck a spark, which touched off loose powder in the roadway near the lab, which then traveled up the porch and set off several barrels of gunpowder. Well, when Symington heard the results of the inquest, he angrily called for a military inquest, which began October 15, 1862. After extensive examination and testimony, its tribunal ruled that Symington had not acted improperly and that no blame could be put on him. It went on to lay the blame on the deceased Mr. Smith, disregarding the testimony of Mr. Frick and Ms. Dunlap. Additional information from Symington's testimony at the coroner's inquest brought in McBride's report of the DuPont Company recycling its empty barrels. The testimony of both Symington and McBride seemed to imply that defective barrels could have caused powder to spill in transit, thus making the road a fuse for explosion. The one point that most witnesses agreed on was that the leaky barrels used by DuPont to ship their gunpowder to the arsenal played a key role. Many witnesses reported seeing the barrels leaking powder as they were moved around the arsenal. McBride was suspicious that the parties shipping powder may have used barrels more than once for the shipment of powder, as the barrels had been returned to them at their request. No further investigation was made, perhaps because DuPont was the largest manufacturer of gunpowder for the Union, or maybe the military just wanted to close the books and continue wartime production. But in the end, the final word belongs to the Army inquiry, and their ruling was the exact cause is unknown. The explosion remains one of the great mysteries of history. To this day, no one knows for sure what happened at 2 p.m. on September 17, 1862. Okay, so time to lay some blame here. The three men charged with being grossly negligent in the explosion were the Arsenal Commander John Symington, his subordinate, Second Lieutenant John R. Eady, and Alexander McBride. The military board did exonerate Colonel Symington of wrongdoing, but he was relieved of his command at the Arsenal and put on sick leave from November 1st, 1862 to June of 1863, and then transferred to the Naval Shipyard at Washington City, where he was soon retired. Broken and dispirited, he died on April 6 in 1864 in Maryland. John Eady was transferred in December and served with General Meade, continuing in the military after the war, but sadly died in an insane asylum in 1874 at age 36. McBride remained on the job at the Arsenal through 1865, which to me speaks loudly. After the explosion, McBride lived a life of seclusion. But on September 22nd, 1890, he attended a reunion of the survivors and the family members. Sharing his story, he said, "I suffered with you all. I lost a beloved daughter, but I have more to bear than any of you who lost dear loved ones or suffered personal injury. I was made to bear the brunt for the guilty one. To this day, I often hear myself censured on the street when passing the Arsenal and denounced as worse than any devil in hell. I was told to leave the city and threatened with tar and feathers. I was innocent. No one knows what I've suffered in these years." McBride submitted a petition to the U.S. Congress signed by 300 former employees and 1,000 local residents demanding $30,000 in compensation to be split among the victims and the families. The request was denied. No government compensation was provided except for 39 coffins for the unidentified victims. So work at the arsenal continued. Temporary buildings were erected and a new laboratory was constructed the following year. Officials put the tragedy aside as cartridges still needed to be made for the Union Army. With the end of the war, the importance of the arsenal decreased, and by 1875, the Ordnance Department was recommending that the arsenal be decommissioned. However, the arsenal did continue to serve as a supply depot and military outpost until 1906, when it was designated and named the Pittsburgh Storage and Supply Depot of the United States Army. 2 years later, it was home to the U.S. Bureau of Mining testing facility. And after some brief activity in World War I, the arsenal was sold in 1926 at public auction to Howard and Clifford Hines, who built warehouses on the parade grounds for their growing ketchup and condiments company. A school was built there too. Originally, the arsenal covered 38 acres. Today, there are 3 surviving buildings in the 9-acre Arsenal Park. One is intact. The site of the explosion is now a ballpark appropriately named Arsenal Park. The original powder magazine has been converted into a maintenance shed for the park. On the wall of the shed is a plaque reminding people of the tragedy that took place there in 1862. This site is located in what is currently 39th and 40th Streets in Pittsburgh. September 17th, 1862 was indeed a tragic day, the bloodiest battle of the war and the worst civilian disaster of the war. The tragedy at Lawrenceville is just as real as the tragedy on the battlefield. This event did not distinguish between combatants and innocent teenage girls, marking that the line between battlefield and home front no longer existed. However, the women who died as patriots remain largely forgotten. On the afternoon of September 18th, the unidentified remains in the 39 black coffins provided by the U.S. government were lowered into a vast common grave donated by the Allegheny Cemetery. In 1863, an Egyptian obelisk inscribed with the names of the victims were placed on this common grave. A simultaneous burial took place of 15 explosion victims in the nearby St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery. Over time, the names on the obelisk became unreadable, and in 1923, the 16 SUVCW camps Allegheny County and their respective auxiliaries raised funds for a more appropriate and lasting monument. That monument stands today on the site of the mass graves of those who lost their lives in the explosion. The monument lists all 78 names so that they and their sacrifice for the Union are not lost to history. And I'll close with the inscription that's on the monument, as it might be hard to read there. Tread softly, this is consecrated dusk. 45 pure patriotic victims lie here, a sacrifice to freedom and civil liberty, a hard memento of the most wicked rebellion. Patriots, these are patriots' graves, friends of humble, honest toil. These were your peers. Fervent affection kindled these hearts. Honest industry employed these hands. Widows, orphans' tears have watered the ground. Female beauty and manhood's vigor commingle here. Identified by man, known by him, who is the resurrection and the life, to be made known again when morning cometh. Thank you for your attention tonight.
Julianne, could you take a couple questions?
Sure.
I'd like to do the first question. How in demand was this, or how easier in demand was this job for these girls and young women to get at the arsenal? Was it very difficult, or was because the volume of cartridges and how successful the arsenal was, they needed constant, more and more girls, more and more women to work at the Arsenal.
From what I've read, I think was pretty easy. You know, they had to be recommended, like, you know, like the clergy, make sure that everything was going good and they were, you know, women of outstanding, you know, yeah, character, thank you. But I think, you know, they really needed work. I mean, like 128,000 cartridges a day, that's a lot of cartridges
Right.
to put out. So I think they, you know, it was good, it was a good job. I mean, it paid more than what the soldiers were getting paid, so.
You said it was, what, 50 cents to
To $1.10 a
day?
day, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
Yes, sir.
The road, after the explosion and the tragedy, did they do anything to make the roads safer?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I never read anything that they did. You would hope that they did, but you know, Alexander McBride pushed for it from the beginning, but he was still held guilty because I guess he didn't stick to his ground, but
Why did they guilty of negligence?
yeah. You know how it is, like everybody just kept pushing what I read, like everybody just kept pushing the blame around, you know, and it was like, hey, we need cartridges. So sad, too bad. Let's move on. Let's make more cartridges. Yes, sir.
To the pay to the girls and ladies was less than what would have been paid to guys.
The wage was less.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It was a really good wage for the time. And that's why a lot of you know, the parents wanted their children to work there because they needed the money. The fathers were going off to war. And so, yeah, the boys were not performing. They were just making trouble. So Colonel Simeon got rid of them. Yeah, boys will be boys. But I read somewhere, didn't work this, there have been like no less than 11, there were no less than 11 other explosions in other munitions factories that used DuPont powder that resulted in 100 deaths. So DuPont was just, I think they were really very negligent, but who's going to do anything to DuPont? That's my understanding. That's my personal understanding.
Were there any standards that came out on other facilities or newer buildings on how to control an explosion as it happened? Any lessons learned, like how not to have 500 people in a building?
I didn't read anything to that effect. You know, I don't, in those days and age, they didn't have OSHA, you know, monitoring the workplace. It was
I
just
think there's two
get the
things to
work
point
done.
out. One is, as the government often does, they blame it on the deceased guy, Mr. Smith. Who couldn't, you know, so they blame it on him. What better way to get the military to get around that? Number two is, they're up and running in 6 weeks.
Right.
Arsenal was.
So there's one thing about planning, but the other one is about engineering for facilities and production, how to make that safe. So I imagine, you know,
I think it was a different time back then.
Oh.
In our day and age, we try to make things better. They just keep moving on because people are expendable, especially women.
Specifically so that the wall lasts out. They were scared, buildings were scared, and they had a primitive, essentially a sprinkler system to stop the fires when they came. They still had, and they still had an explosion in there too.
Yeah.
fewer about.
Monday fewer died, yeah.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Julianne.